The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus spoke to his disciples about the end which is to come. In those days, after the time of suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Then he will send out the angels and gather his elect from the four winds, from the ends of the earth to the ends of heaven. From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as its branch becomes tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also, when you see these things taking place, you know that he is near at the very gates. Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But about that day or hour, no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. The Gospel of the Lord. Today we celebrate the 33rd Sunday in Ordinary Time. Next week we will close out our church year with the 34th Sunday, the Feast of Christ the King. And always at the end of one church year and in the opening days of a new church year, there's a certain apocalyptic theme that comes about in the prayers of the Mass and particularly in the readings of the liturgy. We find this today, especially in our first reading and in our gospel passage. The first reading is from the book of Daniel. It's a book that purports to speak about largely events in the 5th century BC, and with a fair bit of sweep of history after that. But it's really a book that seems to be reflecting and was probably written in the early to mid-2nd century BC. It is an apocalyptic book. It is really at the beginning of what we call the apocalyptic age of the sacred scriptures. And this book was particularly of interest to the church because Jesus seemed to have been very interested in it. Jesus chose as a way of referring to himself, and it's witnessed in every strand of tradition that we have about Jesus, with the terms, the Son of Man. How often when we hear Jesus speaking in the Gospels, he refers to himself as the Son of Man this, the Son of Man that. And that expression, the Son of Man, is coming from the book of Daniel, and particularly in one of the apocalyptic visions that Daniel has. It will be our first reading next Sunday for the Feast of Christ the King. And so, in this book of Daniel, the main message of it is calling for faithfulness. That's the main message of all of the apocalyptic literature of the Bible. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. But those who are wise They shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead many to righteousness, they will be like the stars forever. In our gospel, we're listening to chapter 13 of Mark's gospel. We're near the end of our read-through of Mark's gospel that we have been doing throughout this year. And that chapter 13 is kind of a mini apocalyptic teaching that Jesus gives. We particularly find it in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, although Mark is the shortest and the simplest of these little apocalypses that Jesus gives. And so again, Jesus is speaking, and I suspect that Jesus expected that the end would come either during his time or very soon thereafter. It appears when we read St. Paul, he had the same expectation, and most of the early Christians did. It was only later in the first century that they started to realize, under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, that the end times would come when God wanted them to come. And they would not necessarily be quickly. And then the same message that we found in the book of Daniel is the message ultimately of the gospel, to remain faithful. And so as we draw near to the end of this church year, that's the message that the church, through its liturgy and through its scriptures, is giving to us. Remain faithful. None of us knows when the end of the world will come, notwithstanding some of the pronouncements of our politicians. None of us knows when the end of the world will come, and there's a pretty good chance it'll come individually for me and for each one of you in God's own time. But whether we're here when the end comes, or whether we go one at a time, the message is the same. Remain faithful.